Like me, you've probably grown tired waiting for the Elder Scrolls 6. The last time I and most other gamers stepped foot in the immersive world of Tamriel was in Skyrim, a whopping 13 years ago. Well, that was until I recently started playing the spin-offs, aka the games between games. Ever since the early days of the series, Bethesda has been releasing smaller spin-off titles on a wide variety of platforms, all set in the same universe but with vastly different styles of gameplay. While I personally enjoy these weird series offshoots, others view them more as time wasters meant to keep us busy until the next mainline game. That's hard to argue with when looking at the post-Skyrim release gap. In order to quench our thirst during this drought, we've been provided spin-offs such as ESO, Legends, Blades, and Castles, all of which are very different from the traditional open-world role-playing Elder Scrolls experience. When discussing these titles online, the conversation is usually on the not-so-positive side, with fans calling them worthless cash grabs. But is that true? Are they truly not worth playing? I wanted to find out. See, I have experience with the Elder Scrolls spin-offs. I've actually played 5 already. After beating Battlespire, Redguard, Stormhold, Dawnstar, and Shadowkey, I came to the conclusion that while they don't provide the same gameplay experience, they still have the ability to be quite enjoyable. Will that be the case for the post-Skyrim era spin-offs? It looks unlikely. Regardless, I'm still determined to beat everyone, no matter how long it takes. Before we break down the controversial post-Skyrim spin-offs, we first need to check out one more old school title that doesn't receive nearly any hate at all because no one knows it exists. Every Elder Scrolls fan is aware of the classic 2006 mainline title Oblivion, but how many of those same fans are aware of the mobile phone downport made of that game, released 2 months later? Yes, we do have one more Java title to crank out, but luckily the visuals this time around aren't half bad. Similar to the previous mobile titles, this falls under the Elder Scrolls Travels branding, signifying its ability to be played on the go. This isn't always the case, as one of the devs claimed it doesn't belong under the test name because it's not an original story, although images online say otherwise. It doesn't really matter, as everyone just refers to this game as Oblivion Mobile. That lack of an original story, and the fact this is technically just a port, makes it almost not qualify for a discussion about spin-offs. But come on, look at this gameplay. I think everyone can agree this is an entirely different experience. Now, I'm no Oblivion expert, but the story here is said to be a simplified version of the one present in the PC and console versions. It's centered around finding the lost heir to the throne, all while stopping the invasion of our old buddy Mehrunes Dagon through his numerous Oblivion portals. Some collectors out there might know of this obscure title via this little pack-in flyer included in the normal versions of Oblivion. On that flyer, you can see Virtual Studios is again behind the development, and again the game is acquired through your cell phone provider. Worth noting in that same interview I showed earlier, how the dev team was aiming for a smaller game than Stormhold and Dawnstar in order for it to be playable on a wider range of phones, therefore reaching more players. The dev goes on to say how Oblivion Mobile is available on 75 total phones, opposed to the 22 Stormhold and Dawnstar were on, and the one phone Shadowkey was available on. You might be curious why they just didn't make Oblivion Mobile for the visually superior N-Gage. Well, at this point it was already obsolete and flip phones weren't. Bethesda did attempt a PSP port for Oblivion, again under the Travels name, but it never saw a final release. The only footage that exists for it online comes from a beta version that leaked 10 years after its planned release date. Now, bringing it back to the Oblivion port we did receive, what was it like playing? First of all, I played this via the Java phone emulator K-Emulator, which allowed for a completely silent yet very smooth running and visually appealing playthrough. Oblivion Mobile is by far the shortest Elder Scrolls game out there, with it only being 10 missions long with 4 additional side quests. To reiterate, I'm only here for the main story. I did try out some of those side quests to see what they were like, but I was not focused on beating them. Bringing it back to the beginning of my playthrough, it was time to pick a class. When plopped into the game, my first thoughts were, visually, I like this. Controls-wise, not so much. The isometric spready look they went with here is very distant from the normal Oblivion, but charming as hell. I wouldn't describe the controls as tank-like, but they're just hard to get used to. The jump mechanic especially, man, you really gotta be in the right position to pull it off. It wouldn't be long until I was hit with my first poison spell, which immediately killed me. After looking it up, I realized you essentially have to play with the cure poison spell ability because of enemies like these. My monk class was without that spell, so I decided time to restart and switch to spell sword. Actually, casting the spell did take some effort, but I eventually figured it out and was able to move on and quickly beat the first mission. Before entering the next, the game offered me the chance to save my progress and shop for weapons and armor. I figured I'd save my money for bigger and better things, and instead jumped right into mission 2. Already I found myself in the realm of Oblivion, where I was faced with these goofy looking enemies, which ended up being no big deal as Oblivion Mobile allows you to auto regen health after every combat interaction. It's hard not to love all the enemy designs here. They all have this simplified, semi-recognizable 16-bit look with these funny, fast looping animations. Completing the objective and beating all the remaining enemies was no problem whatsoever. I quickly realized this is probably going to be by far the easiest game in the entire series. Hell, 30 minutes in, I was already given a Daedric weapon. Oblivion Mobile's only real difficulty comes from dealing with the fast-moving text boxes and tricky to manipulate camera. Like here, for example. The only way I could access the final stone deactivation was by brute forcing the camera off screen. When on the next level, again, I was flying through enemies. So much, in fact, I cranked out the entire mission in 3 minutes. Well, that's what I thought at first. Turns out some of these levels are broken into sections, and I was just within the next section. I then decided, screw it, let me crank out one of these side quests real quick to see what they're like. This little side adventure was the first time I actually had to use my health potions, but I was by no means struggling. Once that was completed, I was getting handed Daedric weapons left and right. They wouldn't be too super useful because the poison drain was still my biggest issue. Sure, I could kill enemies pretty fast, but survive the poison long enough to cure it? Not so easy. Luckily for me, Oblivion Mobile allows you to checkpoint in between level sections with infinite lives, so after multiple attempts, I was able to clear the area and move on to the next mission. At this point in the game, I could feel the enemies getting harder. The fire-spitting scamps, and especially the fist-pounding trolls. Bit tricky, but a lot of the times you can just run past them and complete the objective. After only an hour and a half, I had half the game beat. It was at this point when I realized you can surprisingly sell items here via that same shop menu. In Oblivion Mobile, there's many weapons and types of armor labeled in red that you can't use because of your class, so I sold those and used my newly acquired cash to purchase a better weapon. With my new longsword in hand, I was faced against the game's most annoying enemy, spirits. Determining whether these ghostly guys died or not was quite tricky, but I quickly decided to avoid fighting them altogether and just focus on the level's puzzle, which is beaten by activating a few levers scattered throughout the map. Completing this task was extremely simple as enemies are rather easy to dodge. Now into level 7, it was time to break out of my comfort zone and try out the magic. Well, that attempt lasted all of 2 minutes as I quickly grew frustrated with it, resulting in me switching back to my trusty ebony blade. And boy was that the move, because the enemies present here were definitely a step up in difficulty. Thankfully, there are no consequences for dying, so I would just attempt to grab each artifact while dodging and dying endlessly until I could reach new checkpoints and unlock new areas. The deaths really started to ramp up here near the end, but by gulping down some potions and trying out the restore spell, I was able to face the end level boss, take it out with relative ease, which then unlocked the next level. Before entering, I copped myself a nice Lolindir longbow in hopes of it helping me with the increasingly harder enemies. And that it did. With its ranged attack, I could sometimes take out enemies before they even entered on screen. In no time, I was able to continue to the next mission, which took place outside and had a whopping 3 whole enemies to kill. After zigzagging my way through the woods, I eventually reached the final Lich, resulting in one of the easiest boss battles of my life. Because of the spamming input required for the bow, I accidentally drained my remaining cash on a weapon I didn't even have access to use. I wasn't too bent out of shape because I only had 1 level to go. I failed to mention how, up to this point, most of the game you're accompanied by another character, who, instead of walking alongside you, joins you on your journey by literally going inside of you. This final area is really quite small, but filled with enemies that would almost always kill me before they even entered my view. It got to the point where I just said screw it and decided to force my way to the temple door, and just like that, the game was over. I really find it interesting which parts of the original Oblivion story they decided to represent here, and which parts they just go over with on-screen text. Like, I think they did a good job converting the plot into a bite-sized flip phone experience, but I honestly couldn't tell you 100% because damn, the text boxes are hard to scroll. Overall, Oblivion Mobile only took me 2 hours to beat. 2 hours that I would consider quite enjoyable. With that game now out of the way, it's time to dive deep into the post-Skyrim era of the Elder Scrolls series, an era so divisive yet so interesting as it has produced some of the most unique games in the series. Sit back and relax as we investigate whether the spin-off games released post-2011 are truly not worth playing or possibly underappreciated bangers. This video is brought to you by Displate. Displates are metal posters that attach to your wall with ease and come in over 2 million different designs. Instead of drilling holes to hang your posters, displates are hung up using a magnet mounting system. I snagged one from Magic the Gathering, Star Wars, Cuphead, and of course one featuring art from the Elder Scrolls. Not only are displates very easy to hang up, but the magnet mount also allows you to swap out artwork whenever you want. Displate's extensive library of designs made it super easy to find ones I liked. Unlike traditional paper posters, Displate's vibrant colors stay vibrant and never fade. They also just released Displate Textura posters, which feature unique textured finishes. For example, my Harry Potter poster has these neat embossed wands. Displate offers fast delivery and includes everything you need to hang them up right inside the box. So click the link in the description or use my code RECOLLECT, notice the 2 C's, to receive at least 25% off, or if you buy 3 or more, you get 30% off. So if you're like me and have incredibly varied interests, don't worry because Displate has you covered. Thank you to Displate for sponsoring this video. Now, originally I thought no way I would include ESO in this challenge because the game is well known for its massive amount of expansions, making for a story that would likely take me ages to complete. I figured I'd come up with some weird caveat to get around beating it because I was reading online how it takes some players literally thousands of hours to complete. So why am I discussing it? Did I spend the last several months of my life solely beating ESO? No. Thankfully, the game has a main story for me to focus on. One that does not require 1,000 hours. Instead, only a few. Don't get me wrong, there is an absolutely bonkers, crazy, insane, ludicrous amount of content available here in ESO, but I cannot possibly discuss it all. Instead of attempting to encompass ESO's entire existence, I'll instead speak more broadly and more from my perspective. From what I remember, when ESO first released in 2014, it had a lot of detractors. Not only for the fact that it was not like Skyrim and instead a MMORPG, but also for its convoluted monetary structure. A year after release, the game was rebranded and re-released under the new name The Elder Scrolls Online Tamriel Unlimited, signifying the removal of the required online subscription. This change was received positively by fans and has since led to a long and prosperous life for the game. I say that because ESO has been receiving new content and updates for over 10 years now. The developers behind the game, ZeniMax Online Studios, are really devoted to keeping this game alive and do so via frequent DLC. ZOS is so committed to keeping ESO relevant, it was even made playable on the wildly popular Google Stadia. Throughout its lifetime, ESO has received many of what's called expansions and many of what's called chapters. I won't break down all the specifics, but just know that some include new map segments and story quests, and others don't and instead include different types of DLC. That's why I thought ESO would take a lifetime to beat. Look at how much content is here. Despite this game's still somewhat shaky reputation, I've always thought the idea of the Elder Scrolls world taking place in an MMORPG was a great idea. The way the devs reimagined old Elder Scrolls locations with all these new characters and took the time to voice act them all with juicy bits of new lore, it's really a fan's dream world. If I had infinite time, I would sit down and play each and every chapter, but for time's sake, I stuck to the game's main story, which thankfully is clearly labeled as such. Good thing I'm not playing this pre-rebrand because the main story used to have hefty level requirements, only allowing the player to progress missions every 5 levels. Worth noting for 2025, ZOS announced that they are no longer releasing stories in a chapter format and are instead switching to a more traditional seasonal update model. Now that you're somewhat caught up with the need-to-know info, let's get into it. Playing ESO in 2025 can be a seamless experience. For me, it wasn't even close to one. I won't bore you with the details, but my struggle involved a broken Steam launcher, false antivirus flagging, non-existent email verification codes, disappearing support tickets, AI bot responses, accidentally uninstalling all my Steam games, multiple 100GB installs, the inability to return my game, rebuying the game on Xbox, rebuying the game on their website, and then finally I could play. So if you also want to give ESO a try, avoid the Steam version at all costs. Once I calmed down and logged in, I was played a very impressive looking intro cinematic that immediately got me excited for what was to come. When at the character creation screen, I designed myself a badass orc Templar aptly named Porkin Orcs. Something I really appreciated being able to choose was my voice. When it comes to the main story here in ESO, it's hard to recap quickly, but essentially has you try and stop the evil Daedric prince Molag Bal from achieving his evil scheme with the help of a group of characters known as the 5 Champions. Now, it's really hard to specify the exact amount of required missions within the main story. Halfway through the game, many branching storylines are involved. It gets complicated. If I had to say, it's probably around 20 total missions. There's several flowcharts out there attempting to guide players through, but just know it's easier to experience than to explain. Right away, I was a fan. The art style, the atmosphere, the combat, it was checking all the boxes. The third-person perspective did take some getting used to, but I quickly grew accustomed to it. I wasn't 100% sure where to go and what to do, so I was just going around killing what looked like needed killed, all while passing other online players. This is a phenomenon I'm not used to with Elder Scrolls games. One moment you're completing an objective and out of nowhere comes a real person. Quickly, I could tell this was going to be a pretty linear experience, which isn't bad. I just assumed given the map size, it would be more open. That's not to say the game holds your hand. I got lost on what to do almost immediately. While searching through the familiar town of Stros Mackay, I had no clue how to continue the story. Turns out I was dropped there because of my chosen alliance, and I had to find my way to Daggerfall. I didn't know this at first, so I spent a fair amount of time doing a worthless side quest. After leveling up a few times and eventually looking up my next step, I made my way to Daggerfall using the very satisfying first-person point of view. To me, this makes playing feel like a mainline game, so I used it a good amount of the time. Before starting the first big quest, I had to take some time and soak in the world. Man, I was really loving all the little details and running into other online players, all within such an iconic area. And the way the story is presented to you, I wasn't expecting this level of voice acting combined with these cutscene-like sequences. You definitely get a full-fledged single-player experience here if that's what you're looking for. Once that sequence concluded, I made the short journey back to Daggerfall where I was immediately granted my next quest. That's how the main story works here. Finish a mission, enter Daggerfall, receive the next one. Finish a mission, return to the stairs, and repeat. For a majority of the game, I'd simply just touch the staircase and whip right back around to continue the quest. Using the first-person perspective, I really felt as if I was playing a Skyrim-era sequel. That was until some crazy-looking rando crossed my path and I remembered I was in an MMO. While admiring the design of this chubby fellow, my game crashed, thus restarting the entire mission. But no worry, as I was enjoying the game so much, I didn't mind a little backtracking. I mean, get a look at this. Did you think ESO was gonna look this good? I didn't. Props to the creature designers here. I only saw a few of the game's numerous monsters, but loved the design of each one I encountered. One part of the game I never truly got a full grasp on was the inventory system and menus you have to navigate. I understood them enough to get by, but was fairly overwhelmed by the info presented within them. Difficulty-wise, ESO is extremely easy. Now, this is likely because I started right away on the main quest at such a low level, but wow, was the entire game a walk in the park. Yeah, there were a few tricky enemies, but I don't think I'd consider ESO even a quarter as hard as, say, Battlespire or Redguard. Plus, dying here has little to no consequence, so respawning and trying again almost always worked for any semi-difficult enemy. One part of ESO that took some major getting used to is how nearly every NPC has a quest marker above their head. Determining which marker was the marker I needed took some time, but by using the map in addition to some online help, I was able to manage. While continuing my way through this Cold Harbor quest, I had my first run-in with not a Flame Atronach, not a Frost one, but a Flesh Atronach. How dope are these guys? If you can't already tell, most combat interactions are very hack-slashy, which is typical for an MMO. A lot of times, a fight that was meant to be hard would be made easy when the creature would target my companion NPC instead of me. In order to take out enemies faster, I was on a constant search for better loot, but better weapons and armor are given to you at a pretty slow rate. I believe this is because of how long the devs intend you on playing, which is hundreds of hours. I'm fine with that. I honestly stopped trying to uncover hidden treasure early on because most of what I found was just lockpicks. I was able to upgrade my combat at least with the unlocking of skill abilities. Before I was able to test those out, I was jump scared by this little guy informing me on where to continue the story. Sometimes you're required to cover some significant ground between quest givers, but I never really minded the travel as the world was such a joy to venture through. I still can't get over how detailed these areas are, at the scale at which they're at. It's crazy. The sheer size of these maps, combined with how much there is to do, combined with some very smart design decisions, allows for some next level immersion. I was getting to a point in the story where the objectives asked of me took very little time and effort, especially with those skill abilities that made combat even easier. I just felt like I was flying through the story. I wasn't even occasionally dying anymore. That was until I tried using the bow, which resulted in numerous L's. After finishing up the objective in one of the most beautiful locations in the series, I cranked out a laughably easy boss fight, and bam, I was essentially at the story's midpoint. Now, with more companions alongside me, the game was made even simpler. In this type of situation where little effort is required, I tend to just solely focus on the plot and view the easy combat as a way to get to the next story segment. I was definitely having fun though. These new skill abilities made for way more dramatic battles. In order to keep up with my fellow server sharers, I finally got my hands on a horse, which I then used to reach my next quest. When it comes to the actual story present here, it's passable but not fantastic. The characters, the locations, the overarching lore, it's fine and visually top-notch, but I don't know, it's just missing a little something. It's very predictable and the characters are likable enough, it just doesn't grab you, you know? Missions start to follow a very similar structure and hit on a lot of the same beats. Every so often you're thrown a new puzzle or objective, but not too often. I'm not going to fault the game for being too easy, I just wish there were a few more twists and turns. In order to spice up my gameplay, I attempted to buy some weapon and armor upgrades, but the whole vendor element of the game seemed like a waste of time. Everything they were offering was super low level, so I figured if I wanted to upgrade gear, I'd have to find it naturally. Seeing what some of these players have become was really awe-inspiring. Some of their outfits were equal parts amazing, equal parts scary. At this point in the game, the main story starts to branch off a bit with new characters and new areas, which was welcomed because, like I said, the story was getting a tad stale. Originally, I thought I was totally lost and all these mission opportunities were side quests that I accidentally completed, but I later found out they're all part of that required flowchart. That realization took me an embarrassingly long time to make. Navigating and surviving this new area was no easy task. If it wasn't for the UESP, I would have zero clue how to progress. Once finally within one of these new Cold Harbor missions, I was pleasantly surprised by the objective variety. What I was doing wasn't too revolutionary and still quite easy, but fun and lore-filled enough to keep me entertained. There were times I would attempt to avoid all combat to skip through an area, but that just resulted in these chaotic enemy clumps. Within those clumps, I would encounter some familiar frosty foes from past titles. Crazy creature encounters would be non-stop as I continued to fly through this story branch. After completing the world's slowest rotation puzzle, I was faced with one more of these 20v1 clusters that in any other Elder Scrolls game would be impossible to survive, but here they're surprisingly manageable. I think this is why the main story previously had level requirements to stop players from speedrunning through like I was. The next few missions didn't introduce much of note, it was a lot of the same. Defend this area, beat this boss, solve this easy puzzle, defend this area, beat this boss, solve this actually not so easy puzzle. These sections are by no means boring, just a little samey. It wasn't until I got back on the main story that things started to pick back up. Before entering the final mission, I wanted to upgrade my look a bit with one of those pets everyone besides me was in possession of. Some of the ones available here are insane, with my favorite being this tiny Molag ball. I found a vendor selling some, but couldn't figure out the purchase, so I said screw it, I'll continue on solo. As the final battle grew near, I was faced with many decisions to make, including this GTA-style choice of which main character needed to die. For me, it was a no-brainer, the old man had to go. When it was time to finally fight Molag Bal, I was greeted with a shockingly cinematic boss battle. Like all things ESO, difficulty-wise, it was a piece of cake, and visual-wise, it was amazing. The whole boss battle was really well done in my opinion. There were quite a few memorable sequences. With Molag Bal now defeated, that marks the end of my time with ESO. According to the UASP, there are 2 additional missions, but they're more of an epilogue that allows you to experience questlines from other alliances, which is cool, but this fight felt final. Overall, ESO was a joy to play. I really did not think it'd be as great as it was, and I only scratched the surface of the content available here. All the little details, all the cool interactions, all the incredible design decisions, it made for such a unique Elder Scrolls experience. If you're like me, you could force ESO to feel like a single-player mainline game, or just play as intended and have fun with friends. My time on ESO totaled around 14 hours, but if you plan on playing the Steam version, expect to double that time just for the install. Despite existing in that post-Skyrim era, I only have positive thoughts for ESO. Will that be the case for the next spinoff? Let's find out. Elder Scrolls Legends, another post-Skyrim release with a somewhat shaky reputation. Released in 2017, 3 years after the launch of ESO, was this game that provides the most unique spin-off experience yet. Reason being, Legends is a card game. Now, obviously this was made in an attempt to replicate the success of Hearthstone and Magic Arena. Was this attempt successful? No. In case you didn't know, Legends will be shut down permanently on January 30th, 2025. This news is especially sad because the game is entirely server-based, with no physical copies ever made. This is just another example of a game that will be lost to time because of the way modern games are playable. Luckily, a solid effort has been made online to archive large portions of the game. Legends has always been a free-to-play title with microtransactions, but since the shutdown announcement, the game is really free to play. After the announcement, all transactions in the game were made to cost a single coin, which is essentially free. Thankfully, I had Legends downloaded early because the Steam version was immediately delisted following the announcement. The only other way to play Legends was on mobile. Other ports were announced but never released. Legends kind of had a rough go from the start. Ever since it released, it's received a sort of artifact reputation where fans were expecting a new series entry and instead got a card game. Now, I'll say it right away, I like Legends a lot. Most Elder Scrolls fans do not. Probably because they haven't tried it out, and now they won't have the chance. Legends was originally developed by Direwolf Digital, but it was eventually passed off to Sparky Pants Studios a year later. After the switch, the game was altered in many ways that pissed off fans. I can't speak on these changes as I'm new to the Legends scene, the now non-existent scene. In 2019, Legends Asia released, but was quickly shut down. Then re-released in China in 2023, but again quickly shut down. That version does have some significant differences, but not enough for me to consider it a different game. I couldn't play it even if I wanted to though. And lastly, there was also a cancelled version of the game, again made only for China, but that never came to fruition besides a few screenshots online. Going back to the version I played, there is a story mode, believe it or not. The base game came with a main story titled The Forgotten Hero, which loosely can be summarized as you the player need to complete several tasks and take out many enemies with the end goal of stopping the evil Lord Nerafin from fulfilling his Daedric prophecy. I was shocked to discover there was a main story for me to focus on, as well as 3 additional stories that are available via DLC. I of course did not beat these, even though their story concepts and settings looked interesting. Alongside these expansions, there were also many card packs released throughout the game's life. They were themed around and featured characters from Skyrim, Oblivion, Morrowind, and ESO. That's essentially where the game gets its name, by showcasing iconic figures, aka legends from the entire Elder Scrolls series. These sorts of releases occurred regularly until 2019 when Sparky Pants ceased updating the game. In the end, all the DLC and expansions led to over 1,500 different cards. Fast forward to 2025, the game is about to die. I wanted to beat the main story, which is 20 chapters long, so I launched my soon-to-be defunct application and began playing Legends for my first and last time ever. Worth mentioning right off the bat, I am a Magic the Gathering player, so I knew learning this was going to be no problem as most CCGs are based around Magic. Also, something I want to make clear is I'm aware discussing and showing a game like this has the potential to be very boring, but I'll try my best to keep it as basic and easy to understand as possible. I would say this is better experienced than explained, but that's no longer possible, so you're stuck with me. You might be curious how a storyline can be weaved into a card game like this. Well, it's accomplished via animated art cutscenes combined with loosely tied together card battles that continue on an overarching narrative. As you can probably guess, all the matches within the story have you face against AI characters that are relevant in the plot. In order to not completely turn your brain off out of boredom, I will attempt to explain the game's rules in the most basic way possible. Each player usually starts with 30 health. Your goal is to knock your opponent's health to 0. This is accomplished by using the game's 4 card types: creature cards, action cards, support cards, and item cards. All of these cards fall under certain colors which each have established playstyles. Once you have a grasp on which colors work well together, you craft a deck of between 50 to 100 cards. Each turn, you grab a card and are given 1 magicka, which is essentially the currency you spend to cast cards. The cards you cast either summon creatures, give your creatures advantages, apply effects to the battlefield, or can be directly targeted at a player. Battling creatures here is simpler than you might think. Make sure you have enough health to live and deal enough damage to kill. When your health starts to diminish, you start to lose runes, which allow you to receive a free card that sometimes can be played right away. There are many other things to consider while playing, but that covers the basics. Legends is mostly known for its unique implementation of 2 lanes instead of the traditional 1. The second lane is typically called the Shadow Lane and allows any creatures placed within it partial immunity for 1 turn. As a Magic player, many of the game's mechanics came as a nice surprise. The runes and double lane concept especially, they make for a unique CCG experience. There's many other interesting changes made from Magic that I personally really enjoy, like the ability to target your opponent directly, how it's impossible to miss a mana drop, the lack of stringent attack phases, the Magicka Ring item which evens out player order advantage, the fact you can target specific blockers, and how creature health here doesn't reset on the next turn, they instead remain wounded. A lot of that probably means nothing to you unless you're familiar with Magic. I only list them to prove how this simply isn't a copycat. Legends provides vastly different gameplay. Right away, I thought the concept of the Elder Scrolls world and characters existing within a card game is actually a pretty great idea. I know this game pissed off fans because they prefer a Skyrim sequel, but the fantasy vibe mixed with the classic Elder Scrolls races, combined with the potential of lore building and art featuring characters from every game, makes for a solid Elder Scrolls experience. All the little animations, sound effects, and voice acting to me make it feel like I'm in a Whiterun tavern acting out imaginary wars with these cards that reference previous battles and in-universe folktales. It wouldn't be long until I was taking part in my first card pack opening session. Now, I can see this loot boxy element of the game being incredibly annoying, but like I said, for me they were made essentially free, so I opened a couple to see what potential fire I could unpack. Like many games, the goal is to receive high rarity cards, which I did not. Man, some of the art seen on these cards is incredible. It's sad to think how much work went into all 1,500 of them, and now they're unplayable. When it comes to the cutscenes, I have zero issue with them being animated 2D art slides, but I do have an issue with how most of them have to be watched through this tiny viewing window. I think it just unnecessarily obscures the artwork and makes for a subpar viewing experience. These early matches were extremely simple, with them mostly being tutorials. Something I think is really neat is how the game further connects the story to the gameplay by providing branching plot directions via cards to choose. I thought these were a very clever way of providing narrative context in place of a cutscene. Every so often, I'd switch the deck I was using in order to experience as many different cards as possible. This was also needed as matches were getting a little trickier around the Chapter 6 mark. Just look at how close some of these games were getting. Legends has a really solid gameplay loop of giving you new cards only after you've seen them used by your enemies. This allows you to already know how they're played without completely spelling it out for you. Overall, Legends does a great job explaining exactly how everything works. They inform you on every turn, they allow you to reference every move made. I really feel like the learning curve is perfect. It would be in Chapter 8 when my first loss occurred by the hands of Argonian Swims by Night. This led me to customizing my first deck in hopes of improving my chances. And that it did, as I beat the lethal loving lizard and therefore completed the first act, of which there are 3. As a prize, I was handed another free deck, which I figured I'd use for the next couple matches. When in a game, I was told I'd have to deal with 2 windy lanes, which causes creatures to switch sides at random. This sounds annoying, but made for a nice gameplay switch up. There are many lane effects like these, all of which I really think are neat and make Legends stand out from other games. These effects also tie in with what's narratively going on, which again adds to the immersion. This new Act 2 was no joke. I went from close games to getting completely destroyed. I tweaked my deck a few times, but I was still getting pumped. Many of the mistakes I was making was because I was still in that magic mindset. Occasionally I'd receive one of those free rune cards, but again, no W was acquired. It wouldn't be till our 7th match together when I would finally defeat her, allowing me to move on. Something I love about Legends is how it isn't entirely serious. You'd expect a very rigid tone with the art style, but there's a fair amount of humor present here. There's multiple meme references, and just about every goofy Elder Scrolls creature here gets their own card. Now that I was officially at the halfway mark and again faced with another L, I realized I need to get more serious about deck building. Using a single coin, I snagged a set of 60 card packs and got to opening. I didn't bother reading any of the cards because of how long it takes to open this many packs. Using this new batch of cards, I attempted to build the ultimate cheese deck filled with my favorite terms like Drain and Lethal. That combination of cards led me to easily taking out that Spriggan during our second encounter. Now that I was about 4 hours deep, I had a really good grasp on how the game was played. I would carefully switch out my starting hands, I'd put extra thought into my blockers and attackers, and made sure to read every card I was faced with in order to fully understand what I was up against. When it comes to the story up to this point, I couldn't make sense of it at all. There appears to be a somewhat juicy lore-filled story within this game, but with how the cutscenes are so short and separated, it's hard to piece together what's happening. By continuing to use my new deck, wins were more frequent but not constant, as the game always found ways to ramp up difficulty, usually via unique advantages and special abilities that tie into the story. With the help of strategy switch-ups and card trade-outs, some of which were quite overpowered, I was able to defeat more enemies and continue on through the story. I knew I had to eventually open some packs from the expansions, so I snagged a ton of those and started by opening only the fancy looking ones, resulting in the acquisition of many bangers, including one featuring our old ESO buddy Sai Sahan. When back in another match, I found myself playing in one giant lane with the added gimmick of low damage bottles being thrown. This is because of the current bar fight plotline. Pretty neat if you ask me. At this point, I would definitely consider Legends the most fun spinoff. If you enjoyed card games like this and love the Elder Scrolls like I do, you can really have some fun. Too bad it's fucking gone forever. After taking 2 pretty significant losses from an Imperial deserter, I decided it's time to finish off those expansion packs. Over the course of the next 40 straight minutes, I opened card pack after card pack without reading any titles or texts in hopes of having enough worthwhile cards to build myself an endgame deck. Now in possession of 580 cards, I proceeded to upgrade my previous deck into one so powerful it'd hopefully take me all the way to Nerefin. When faced against the Imperial once more, I wiped the floor with him, thus ending Act 2. These deck improvements allowed my health to balloon to insane numbers, which made taking me down almost impossible. This proved to also be true for Chapter 15, Chapter 16 barely, Chapter 17 admittedly took a few tries, but I eventually walked away victorious. Chapter 18 was a complete cakewalk. Chapter 19 also only took one try, therefore placing me in front of Lord Nerfin for the final battle. Right away, I could tell this was going to be rough. This old custom deck I was using wasn't doing the trick any longer. There were many times when it would look like I had him, but then he'd whip out some quick health out of nowhere. He was also just killing creatures like it was nothing. After tweaking my deck some more, I went back in to face him for a third time. Yeah, the typical strategies weren't working out. I'd have to figure out a new plan. It didn't really matter what strategy I implemented or how high my health reached, I continued to lose. On our 5th match together, it was a lot of the same. I'd get him low, but he'd grant himself some health and avoid death once more. On game number 6, I think I knew what to do. Deal as much immediate damage early to skip right to his health step, and then I'd probably be able to play normally and beat him. Things were not going to plan. I was playing so poorly, I chose to concede. Match 7 started with the High Elf whipping out that stupid ass Destroy Creature card, which cleared my board. When at 50 life points, I was able to trigger his health phase, leaving me with only a few moves to go, and bam, I finally beat him. With all 3 main story acts now complete, I felt relieved that I was able to experience Legends before its shutdown. Sadly, I won't be able to play the other DLC or check out all the other content present in the game, like the PvP arena mode or the fun puzzles available. I know a card game like this isn't for everyone, but I enjoyed it a lot. During my 8 hours played, I had a ton of fun. Similar to ESO, this was surprisingly good despite being a post-Skyrim spinoff. If only more people gave it a shot. Maybe one day a resurrected version will become playable, but until then, rest in peace, Legends. You'll forever be remembered as that underrated Elder Scrolls card game that did a lot of things right besides release physically. Elder Scrolls Blades, developed by Bethesda Game Studios in 2020, I can confidently say is the worst game in the entire series. There's so much to get into with this title, I don't even know where to begin. 3 years after the release of Legends, we received this free-to-play game that, on the surface, looks pretty good, but when you actually sit down and play it, you quickly realize it's soulless garbage. It's safe to say this has the worst reputation of any game Bethesda has ever made. This is because of Blade's extremely egregious microtransactions, very repetitive gameplay, and the fact most game mechanics are held behind timers. We'll get into all of that. But first you need to know I played this on the Switch, which appears to be the inferior version of the game. Many instead play the original mobile version. I would have preferred to play any other of the proposed ports, but those were all quickly cancelled after word spread how trash the game was. When Blades first released, the microtransactions and in-game timers were said to be extra intrusive, but thankfully I did not play during that time. The story present here has you playing as a member of the now disbanded group The Blades, who's tasked with rebuilding their destroyed hometown as well as defeating the undead sorcerer king responsible. Within the main story here, there are roughly 30 missions to complete, but you will have to beat way more than that as the game locks many quests behind level requirements. Reaching the needed levels requires you to beat many side quests, of which there are a ton. The game was marketed as a dungeon crawler, similar to other titles in the series, with many of the dungeons available being procedurally generated. This sounds cool and fancy, but is just a way of saying lifeless, repetitive level design. As you can see from the map, there are many branching storylines that I originally planned on ignoring, but oh boy, this game requires you to be a goddamn completionist. Before I get ahead of myself, let me bring you back to when I first started. Originally, I was excited to play Blades because I have a soft spot for the neglected titles in any series. I knew it wasn't going to be a Skyrim level sequel, but from what I saw, it looked to be a decent enough little title, in the vein of an Infinity Blade game. When I found out Legends was shutting down, I felt some urgency to beat this game quickly as well because, let's be honest, this one is the next one to go, as again the game is entirely server based with no physical copies in existence. Blade's god-awful reputation combined with the fact the game has been completely abandoned, it's only a matter of time. During the installation process, I looked online and was surprised to see essentially no one playing this game. and if they did, they never got far. So I figured, let me be the first to walk you through what it's like playing Blades from beginning to end. For this playthrough, I decided to shake it up and this time play as a randomized high elf. Right away, I noticed that when talking to characters here in Blades, you only hear 1 to 2 lines of voice acting. The rest of their dialogue is text only. I can only guess why this was done, maybe as a time constraint with the actors. Regardless, it's not a big deal, it just takes some getting used to.
We're in your debt for saving us.
In order to get a grasp on which storyline I was to focus on, I checked out the helpful quest map, which appears to label the main story in yellow. Once in a mission, I became accustomed to the controls and quickly came to terms with how linear Blades is. While it might look like a traditional Elder Scrolls game, it's far from. Every level has you completing incredibly simple objectives through a series of essentially hallways. Combat is also extremely restrained. Every fight forces you into an immovable stance, meaning you can never pull off ranged attacks. I get why they did this, it's a mobile game at the end of the day, but wow, I hate it. The inability to flee fights or use bows and ranged magic completely blows. There's a lot more to get into in regards to the combat, but that's for later. While continuing to make my way through these early stages, I opened my first loot box, chest, found my first not so hidden secret area, constructed my first few buildings, and also disabled that wispy blue quest marker because I don't need my handheld any more than it already is. The general gameplay could not be easier. All you do is kill enemies, eat food for health, search for loot, currency, and building materials, and that's basically it. What's asked of you objective-wise is never too complex. It usually only involves finding characters or killing bosses. Visually, I have zero issue with Blades. People like to fault this game for muddy graphics, but I think it looks totally fine, especially for being on the Switch. One of Blades' best qualities is its character customization. I think it's the perfect level of complexity, well laid out, and capable of some serious fine-tuning if you're into that. I'm especially a fan of the green arrow above each item, letting you know when you found your new best piece of equipment. I discovered pretty quickly that here in Blades, all weapons and armor take damage. I absolutely despise this decision. What about that is fun? Repairing thankfully doesn't require a timer, but can become quite pricey. Now, I get they were going for a more casual Elder Scrolls experience, but this is still a rather lazily made game. The procedural generation here simply means you'll be in 1 of 4 areas. That's it. Repeated locations already were prevalent after 2 hours played. At first glance, the fighting in Blades looks super simple, but there's more to it than you'd think. It's a mix of proper timing, elemental knowledge, and having the right skills equipped. I think there actually is a ton of potential with Blades' combat system. It almost works, but man, I could never get it totally down. A lot of that can be chalked up to a skill issue, but trust me, there's a lot of BS on their end too. During this time of struggle, I was blasting through a ton of revival scrolls, not knowing how lucky I was to have those in the first place. The shield-loving skeletons were enemy number 1. I hated those MFs. From this point on, Blades really became a frustrating experience. The difficulty scale felt like it took a giant leap forward. Missions were already labeled 5 out of 5 difficulty. After many attempts, the game seemingly lowered the difficulty, but I didn't know why. I didn't find out till way later that the mission difficulty is based on level and what you have equipped. If the game thinks you'll struggle using what you're using, the level will receive a high rating. If you change what you're holding and wearing, the skulls might be lowered, or raised if you break your armor like I did. I hate this whole idea. Not having a set metric for difficulty leads to a ton of trial and error and feels like the game just wanting me to slow down the main story and pay for upgrades out of frustration. The loop of having to constantly repair things only to then have to pay gems cause you're so broke is infuriating. By the way, gems are the premium currency here in Blades. Sometimes you receive some for free, but most of the time the game wants you to buy them with real money. This is made obvious by the constant pop-up ads forced down your throat. I was at my wit's end with the Bloodfall Queen mission. I was only able to pass it once I realized a lot of the enemies can be snuck past. This isn't a built-in stealth mechanic, I was just cheesing the AI. Because of how expensive repairing was, I needed to sell a bunch of my old gear. You can't sell too much here as the vendors are even broker than you, so most of the time you'll just be salvaging for resources. To better my chances in the next mission, I equipped some magicka and stamina skills. Did they help? No! This mission was also impossible. Out of desperation, I started a side quest in hope of receiving some better gear. That is why I said earlier, Blades requires you to be a completionist. You have to crank out a ton of these side quests in addition to the main story. Yeah, there's other ways of receiving XP, but these branching quest lines seem like the easiest way. Well, I don't know if easy is the best term. Clearing out these areas also sucked. The difficulty increase felt around the 5-hour mark was like nothing I've ever experienced. The feeling of fuck you pay me was so incredibly strong when I was told for the millionth time to pay for a revive. I think this series of pop-ups perfectly exemplifies that. Here's 35 free gems, and here's how much it costs for one chest. You're constantly being told no to everything. No, you can't increase your weapon damage. No, you can't access that level. No, you can't build that building. No, you can't change races for free. I got so tired of being told no, I buckled and paid the needed gems to carry on. I later discovered that only the first revive is 25 gems. It then jumps to 50, then 100. I get why they do this, but it just feels like moving the goalpost. Over the next few hours, I made many attempts to level up my town and increase my player level, but nothing seemed to lower mission difficulty. Most quests on the map were still 5 out of 5 skulls, and we're not even halfway through. I brewed up potions, brought back the clairvoyance, learned to time my critical hits. Nothing was helping. There are moments here in Blades that scratch that spin-off itch. The art style and the linear gameplay, it isn't that bad. It's just the progression structure. It's so complicated. I found myself on a streak of missions that were quite cheesable, but oh boy, once I hit the ruins of Nerastare, my momentum came to a screeching halt. This level was truly a nightmare. Long linear hallways filled almost exclusively with the game's worst enemy. I failed 5 times. 10 times, 15 times, 20 times. It was hell. I even attempted the Joy-Con motion controls option, but quickly found out how worthless that was. I was damaging my weapons and armor at such an unaffordable rate. Something had to change. I tried exploiting the skeleton shock weakness. That was pointless. I looked into the PTSD-inducing sigil store, but realized that requires a third type of currency that I didn't have. I investigated the player-made guilds, but realized those are more for resources. After fail number 35, I figured the game was trying to tell me something, so I decided to crank out some more side content. In an effort to level up and receive better gear, I upgraded my smithy, decorated my town, took and beat every available side quest, upgraded my perks, tempered my weapons, and of course paid to revive myself many times. With better gear and a better understanding of the game, I gave the ruins level another go, and again found myself completely helpless against the skeletons. If I wasn't blasting through resources and waiting on multi-hour timers all the time, I wouldn't have been half as frustrated as I was. In an act of desperation, I asked Reddit for help and was surprised to find several players out there with suggestions. In accordance with what they said, I stopped tempering immediately. I further upgraded my smithy to improve what was for sale. I constructed an enchanter's tower to allow for enchantments. I tried out the Abyss mode, where you go through infinite waves of changing enemies as a sort of XP farm. I cranked out a few jobs, which are low effort quests that infinitely respawn. I successfully completed some sigil events where you have to go through the same dungeon multiple times, each time harder than the last. I tried out this crazy town level exploit where you place and demolish houses only in the lots covered in rubble, allowing for the max prestige, aka what's needed to level up your town. And lastly, I played around in the PvP arena mode to learn to fight. First, I was put against an easy level 7, then right after a level 60 who proceeded to take me out in 2 hits. With all this newfound knowledge, gear, and levels, I jumped back into that damn ruins level and found myself on an insane run. This new Warhammer I was using was just what I needed to take out these bashing bitches. Sadly, the run came to an end, but on attempt number 43, I was able to make it to the final foe, take them out, and finally move on with my life. From there on out, I knew Warhammers were my thing. Their damage output was unmatched. Combined with the dodge health absorb move, it was a game changer. When faced against the next level's end boss, I found myself within an unwinnable fight gemless, leaving me with only one option: pull the wallet out. Up to this point, I was yet to spend any real money, so I figured if it saves me from redoing the mission, that's worth $2. It wouldn't be long until I was faced with another impossible quest. This one took me 11 total attempts and cost me 75 gems, but provided me my first dragon fight and allowed me to skip over what looked to be a required mainline mission. From that point on, my goal was to open chests, grind XP, and upgrade everything as quickly as possible in order to unlock new main story portions and lower those damn difficulty meters. During this time, I was enchanting weapons, completing quest lines, one of which included a puzzle I immediately got stuck in, requiring a game restart. Every so often, I'd run into a cool new area or neat looking enemy, but that was rare. Most areas were near copy and paste of each other. I discovered that completing those sigil events were not only the best for acquiring new weapons, but also great for XP. Beating those combined with continuing that house exploit allowed me to level myself and my town several times. After cranking out another multiple attempt mission, I realized I was getting close to the end. It looked like if I was to complete this statue building quest, I'd maybe be able to skip right to the final fight. With this in mind, I locked in and did what I needed to do. I did more enchanting, I paid more gems, I leveled up further, I paid more gems, I snagged new armor, I paid more gems, I beat another absolutely infuriating quest by paying more gems. Finally, I was able to craft the statue, except I needed more resources and a higher workshop level, of course. This meant completing more side content to receive the needed copper and crystals. I kid you not, between every workshop upgrade, I probably cranked out 10 plus side quests to afford the requirements. During my grind, I was gifted my first pieces of elven equipment, except these have level requirements as well. What game does that? Gathering the needed materials and waiting on the upgrade timers took hours, but eventually resulted in me crafting the statue, placing the statue, and then realizing I can't face the final boss yet. There's still more to the story. The next quest, the Iliad Crown, doable. The one after that, High Treason, not bad either. The one after that, the 5 stones, we're talking Zooey Mama levels of difficulty. The objective here is to track down all 5 elemental stones, each of which is heavily guarded by all sorts of enemies. Whenever you look up the 5 stones online, you see many posts referencing how brutally challenging it is. I also found this to be the case immediately. Something about it just felt different. On try number 4, I accepted that this would require some more real cash. I convinced myself that since the game was free, I would just pay my way through in order to not spend an eternity trying to beat it flawlessly. The gems I had on me only lasted until my 3rd death, to which after I decided to toss $5 in to see if that would do the trick. This time I knew 100% all that was left was the final boss, so I was fine paying. Those 500 gems allowed me to revive for a 3rd time, 4th time, a 5th time, a 6th time, a 7th time, but shortly after grabbing the 3rd stone and dying for an 8th time, I was out yet again. I decided at this point, if I'm going to keep spending money, I might as well go big and snag the 1200 gem package. With $10 worth of gems, I figured this would be more than enough to finish the quest off. When death number 9 came, I revived myself. When death number 10 came, I was hit with this. Blades was telling me, you can't pay anymore. We're capping you at 10 lives. I was flabbergasted to see this bullshit. I was 1 stone away. When was I ever told of this 10 life cap? Never! This is maybe the slimiest, most manipulative game mechanic I've ever witnessed. It wasn't so much about the money, but the idea of the money. I was willing to continue paying, but Blades knows that and instead wants me to slow down further. I was in way too deep to give up now. I knew to beat the 5 stones, I'd have to do what I always do. Lock in and level up. The plan was to level myself up and my gear enough to be able to beat the 5 stones within 10 lives or less. First things first, I had to verify the Goblin Truce rumors. But no, seriously, it was grind time. I started by cranking out 2 entire sigil events. This was accomplished by crafting and enchanting the specific weapons and armor required for each. I then decided for XP I'd crank out an entire side quest line, all the skipped main story missions, another whole side quest line, and then I dove back into the abyss. Once I surfaced, I completed a 5-hour smithy upgrade, bought more weapons and armor, completed more sigil events, and then decided it's time to give the mission another go. I played around with a series of weapons and enemy finessing strategies, but nothing was working. I wasn't ready yet. I then proceeded to finish the entire rest of the optional branching main story, leaving only the 5 stones and final boss battle to complete. During my time, essentially 100%ing the game, I ran into a lot of cool areas, met some really neat looking creatures, and watched some pretty awesome cutscenes, but most of my time grinding was spent playing through procedurally generated slop. Before jumping in for another attempt, I looked up every enemy's exact weakness and crafted and enchanted weapons accordingly, but these weren't getting the job done either. Back to the abyss I went. I kept up this pattern of beat some side content, try to beat the stones, do some more side content, then try again and again, hoping I'd somehow perform better. I knew once I committed to using gems, I'd only have one go at it, as I had enough for exactly 9 revives. There were so many other ideas I experimented with, but nothing ended up being useful. On my 32nd attempt, I tried slowing down the combat and blocking more, and it seemed to be working. After beating more enemies than I ever had on 1 life, I committed. I used my first scroll. I then had to use my second one soon after. To avoid dying in my normal spots, I instead cheesed my way past certain enemies to avoid the fight altogether. By some insane miracle, I made it to the dragon for the first time ever, and oh boy were my hands shaking. I did use some gems, but that was only revive number 3, so I wasn't worried. With 4 of the 5 stones in my possession, I pulled off another tactical dodge, only to then get cut off, requiring the use of gems yet again. Once faced with the final enemy, I could see the light at the end of the tunnel. A revival did occur, but that didn't stop me from grabbing the 5th and final stone, therefore ending this mission from hell. In total, it only took me 5 revives, leaving me with plenty of gems for the final fight. Just leveling up and upgrading to this mission alone took over 9 hours. When in the arena with the final boss, it looked to be a quick, easy fight, but his health was regenerating at a crazy rate. Of course, I couldn't go without dying at least once, but what would I need the gems for anymore, as I just beat the game? I can't tell you how much weight was lifted off my shoulders when that final cutscene played. On the surface, Blades appears to be baby's first Elder Scrolls game, but that's so far from reality. I played for 30.5 hours and I only made it to level 28 out of the 100 available levels. I don't know how or why anyone would want to reach that, because Blades blows. Never has a game failed to explain progression as much as Blades does. The confusing difficulty scaling, the convoluted requirements, the overly egregious timers, and the incredibly lazy level design all added up leads to the worst game in the Elder Scrolls series. Now, I understand this is a free-to-play mobile port. Timers are a thing, but what console is this? The Switch! I'm sorry, but the standards are higher. The standards are higher for Elder Scrolls. This is embarrassing. Blades has this super grimy pay-to-win feel that completely overshadows the good elements present within. There was a documentary made about this game's creation, and within it are some clips that I think speak for themselves.
Because people are going to play for a long time probably. Like, we don't want to stop people with timers or things like that.
Typically, I hate the idea of games getting shut down and going extinct, but in this case, good riddance. Four years after the release of Blades, we received Castles in 2024, a free-to-play game exclusive to mobile platforms that, I'll say right away, was a breath of fresh air. Castles is yet again another post-Skyrim release that not every fan loves, but personally I think it's a great spin-off. The reason behind the hate is because visually it really stands out and is yet again another Elder Scrolls title that isn't Elder Scrolls 6. At this point, people are just tired of waiting. Without the Elder Scrolls title, it would probably receive less flack, but it also would be less interesting. This is again developed by Bethesda Game Studios, which had me nervous, but I'll say right away, I love Castles. I, for one, don't mind the extreme vibe departure. I think spin-offs should feel different. Castles takes place in a kingdom neighboring Rivercrest, which is the town I had to rebuild in Blades. Now, obviously this game is a spin on Fallout Shelter, a construction management game from 2015 based around the Fallout series. I have never played it, but I've always admired the concept, and I'm glad they found a way to bring it over to the Elder Scrolls. Castles provides a unique situation for this challenge, as there is no story mode whatsoever to beat. When I realized this, I decided I'll just play long enough until I feel like I've experienced most of what the game has to offer. I did this by emulating castles through the emulator BlueStacks. In terms of a narrative, there really isn't one. You're really just in charge of building up your castle, ruling over its inhabitants, and making sure they're all in good health, and repopulating constantly. With that said, let's get into it. Off the bat, you might be put off by the cartoony cutscenes, but I kinda like them. It's refreshing. The whole game's art style to me is very charming, but I can see if you find it childish. This early game was spent explaining to me the basics, like how every in-game day is a year for them, how you need to non-stop craft and harvest the materials, and how you make rulings. This is Castle's strongest quality in my opinion. As the king or queen in my case, you're faced with decisions you have to make constantly in the format of rulings that, depending on what you choose, can alter relationships and or resources. I think this idea is really clever and makes for some fun management decisions. Now, I know what you're thinking, where are the microtransactions? I won't lie, they're here, but they're not nearly as intrusive as Blades, not even close. When I was first given some gems, it caused some Vietnam-like flashbacks, but I wasn't too worried. Yes, there are some chest-adjacent packs to open here, but trust me, the monetary format of this game is nothing compared to Blades. It's very easy to have fun and not pay. I was tempted to buy that Redguard Castle theme though. That's pretty neat. Sometimes when leveling up you receive new guests, each of which need to be dragged into the castle. Once inside you need to maintain theirs and everyone else's happiness levels in order for them to not turn evil. I saw in the game's trailer how some can get so angry that they'll assassinate your ruler, so I made sure to keep my decisions balanced to avoid that. Going from the absolutely vein-popping gameplay of Blades to this was so needed. The peaceful soundtrack, combined with the simple world building, combined with the overall tranquil atmosphere, I was really enjoying myself. Castles just does such a great job of explaining what to do and how the game works. Like the building here, it's super user-friendly and just the right level of complexity for a mobile game. Building all the stations and assigning workers is really a fun gameplay loop. I love how you can marry subjects and everyone will just stop what they're doing and crowd around. That's some wholesome shit. You can also pair up couples to make babies, of which go through stages of growth to the point where they can even die off. When you mate with an Argonian, the baby comes out in a shell and even walks around that way. I love that design decision. When you have your king or queen enter the bedroom, there's then heirs to the throne. Heirs that can rule at any age actually. In order to gain access to certain features without paying, Castles gives you the option to watch through ads, and oh boy were some of these tough to sit through. Since there wasn't a main story for me to focus on, I instead kept myself busy by completing all the daily tasks and orders, and continuing to build more workstations when available. One station called the War Table allows you to play through a questline of combat missions involving your inhabitants fighting progressively harder enemies. Now this might appear to be the main story, but it's handled more like a minigame, at least that's what I tell myself because I don't want to beat all 200 quests. When back in the castle, I kept noticing all these neat little details, like how the rooms can change lighting depending on the workstation placed, current oil supply, or if you're cursed or not. Decorations not only add a nice look, but have benefits as well. Ghosts take over for empty workstations. Babies born out of wedlock are labeled as such and given traits based on the parents, traits that can play a big role down the line. Just a lot of great little additions that caught my eye and made for an immersive experience. The more I played, the more I was shocked to see a lot of traditional Elder Scrolls ideas implemented here. While the game might look very unlike the series, there are many elements within that match what I've seen in other titles. The ruling portion of the game never got old to me. The options presented to you are quite vast and add a whole layer of additional story if you follow what narrative each character is going through. I appreciate how a lot of the workstations here provide clever workarounds, like the music stage can be used to raise happiness and the buffet table can be used to increase health. Overall, I found the pacing of Castles to be perfect. Even though I didn't have a set list of missions like normal, I was never bored. The game keeps you busy. It might just be tied with Legends as the most fun spinoff. I don't know. You can judge me for that if you want. I'm just a sucker for these kind of world management games. Honestly, my favorite thing to do was to go around and dress all my people in the proper outfits and equip them with the proper tools to make sure we were achieving max efficiency. Originally, I thought the war table quests were a little too simple and shallow, but the more I played them, the more I enjoyed them. There's more to the fighting than you'd think. I really got a kick out of making my people armor and better weapons to then face off against some recognizable enemies. At level 30, the game gave me an item capable of fast forwarding a year, but I was hesitant to do so because everyone's gonna grow up too fast, you know? I was building up attachments. Every time someone got married, you know I had to watch. Something I always got a kick out of was paying attention to all their chatter and then later remember those same topics of conversation when they ask me to make a ruling about it. That kind of stuff is what makes a world feel alive. The more I thought about it, this is kind of like a customizable living dollhouse, or at least has a similar appeal if that makes any sense. You can also zoom close in and hear all the workers working and their machines running. I know it sounds like I'm sucking this game off, but man, Castles is awesome. Again, to avoid murder, I was keeping my rulings positive. I really gave an effort to spread out the negative decisions among the race groups. Every so often, I'd not read all the needed text and unleash a pestilence among my people, but for the most part, things ran smooth. It wouldn't be till I was several hours in when I realized you can actually sell items here. This is necessary because I always had a lot of duplicates because of the tasks I was completing. You can also choose to stack your weapons, tools, and outfits in order to upgrade them, which I think is a really smart and unique way to level up your gear. Unlike blades, I never found myself needing to use gems. The only thing I could see saving them up for, or even spending real money on, is the few workstations I didn't have access to. The longer I played Castles, the more I noticed lore nods and specific characters that exist in other titles. When looking into it, there's a whole list of characters that share the same name and appearance as NPCs in other games. Worth mentioning is how that neat looking portal also contains a battle mode, but it's not quest based, instead you see how many rounds you can survive. Even though I felt I experienced most of the game at this point, I thought it might be fun to expand the castle and commit to one last major redesign. This idea was sparked by all the crazy builds I saw online. Luckily for me, moving stuff around and reorganizing the castle is very intuitive and doesn't halt production. Your people will just quickly sprint to their new work location. While building, the thought occurred to me that this game could really benefit from a loan system, similar to say the one in Roller Coaster Tycoon. Money is always the resource that slows you down here the most, but I get that they probably don't want you to blast through the game and probably want you to spend real money. Once I finished designing, watching another ad, and spending gems for the first time, I looked around and decided I think I've got the full experience, or at least most of it. When I logged off, my level was 43. I had 31 inhabitants and my gameplay totaled 8.5 hours. If it's not already very clear, I'm a big fan of Castles. I think the whole ruling premise is really well thought out and genuinely very fun. I really hope this performs well so it doesn't suffer the same fate as Legends and, let's be real, Blades. With now all 10 spin-offs beaten, the total time it took to beat all 10 was 116 hours. Of course, some were more frustrating than fun, but for the most part, I enjoyed the experience. To answer that question from the beginning, are the post-Skyrim releases worth playing? Yes, very much so, except for the obvious. Again, I get why fans dislike these kind of releases, but I don't feel the same way most do about them. I don't really think they're time wasters. I view them more as different ways to get immersed into that same fun world of the Elder Scrolls. Will there be more spin-offs? Who knows? If so, count me in. And again, I want to say for Legends, rest in peace. And for Blades, rot in hell.